A 9-year-old boy was left freezing outside on Thanksgiving Day because he asked, why wasn't Grandpa invited? What happened next brought an entire family to tears and changed their lives forever. Subscribe now for more unforgettable stories of love, family, and redemption. Thanksgiving has always meant one thing to me: family. No matter how busy life became, no matter how many miles stood between us, I believed that on Thanksgiving Day, a family belongs together around one table. It's a day of gratitude, love, and warmth. At least, that's what I had always taught my children. My name is Richard. I'm 71 years old, a retired high school teacher, and a grandfather of 3 beautiful grandchildren. I've spent my entire life believing that kindness always finds its way back home. I worked hard, sacrificed much, and gave my children everything I could afford, not because I expected anything in return, but because that's what fathers do. My son, Daniel, was always the one I worried about the least. He was smart, successful, and had built what appeared to be a wonderful life with his wife and children. We didn't speak every day, but I convinced myself that distance is simply another part of growing older. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I called Daniel and asked if I could join them for dinner. There was silence on the other end of the line before he finally said, "Dad, this year is going to be difficult. Sarah's family is coming over and we're running out of space. Maybe next year." I smiled and told him I understood. The truth is, I didn't. How much space does one old man really take at a dinner table? Still, I didn't argue. Children grow up and build lives of their own. That's how it's supposed to be. Thanksgiving morning arrived quietly. My little house felt colder than usual that day. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat beside the window watching families carrying pumpkin pies and grocery bags into their homes. Somewhere, children were laughing while grandparents were being hugged tightly at the front door. And somewhere, my family was celebrating without me. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was my oldest grandson, Ethan. He had just turned 9 years old. "Happy Thanksgiving, Grandpa," he said excitedly. "Happy Thanksgiving, buddy," I replied with a smile. We spoke for nearly 10 minutes. He told me about his school project, his favorite football team, and how excited he was about dessert later that evening. Then suddenly, his voice became quieter. "I wish you were coming today." My heart sank. "So do I," I answered softly. Before hanging up, he whispered something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. "Grandpa, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." "I don't like Thanksgiving anymore." I laughed gently. "Why not?" There was another moment of silence. "Because people act nice when other people are watching." I stopped smiling immediately. "What do you mean, Ethan?" He hesitated before saying, "Never mind, Mom's calling me." And then he hung up. For the next 2 hours, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Children don't usually speak in riddles. They're honest in ways adults have forgotten how to be. People act nice when other people are watching. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. I wasn't going there to ruin anyone's Thanksgiving dinner or make my son feel guilty for not inviting me. I simply wanted to surprise my grandchildren. After all, what grandfather needs an invitation to give his grandson a hug? I stopped by a small bakery and bought Ethan's favorite apple pie. Then I picked up 3 small gifts I had been saving for Christmas. I figured Thanksgiving was as good a reason as any to spoil my grandchildren. The closer I got to Daniel's neighborhood, the more excited I became. I imagined Ethan running toward me with that enormous smile of his. I imagined sitting quietly in the corner, listening to my grandchildren laugh while everyone shared stories around the dinner table. Perhaps Daniel would feel a little guilty for not inviting me. Perhaps he would simply be happy to see me. Either way, I was looking forward to spending a few unexpected hours with my family. When I pulled into the neighborhood, I immediately noticed dozens of cars parked outside their house.
The holiday gathering was obviously already underway. Through the living room windows, I could see people laughing and raising their glasses. Everything looked perfect. Until I saw him. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was a little boy sitting alone on the front steps beside the house. His arms were wrapped tightly around himself as his body trembled against the cold November wind. He was wearing nothing but a thin t-shirt, a pair of shorts, and socks. No jacket, no shoes, no gloves. Outside, on Thanksgiving Day. For a moment, I simply frozen behind the steering wheel, unable to understand what I was seeing. Then he lifted his face. It was Ethan. My grandson's lips had turned pale from the cold, and tears streamed quietly down his cheeks as he tried desperately not to cry. The outside temperature was barely above freezing. My hands began shaking before I had even opened the car door. "Ethan!" I shouted as I ran towards him. The moment he saw me, he stood up and immediately burst into tears. "Grandpa!" he shouted as his tiny arms threw around me as his entire body shivered against my chest. "Oh, God," I whispered as I took off my coat and wrapped it tightly around him. "What happened? Why are you out here?" He looked down at the ground as if he had done something terrible. I wasn't being thankful enough. I thought I had heard him incorrectly. What? Dad said I ruined Thanksgiving. How? He wiped his tears before answering. I asked my grandpa wasn't invited. I couldn't speak. He got angry and told me children shouldn't question adults. Then I said Thanksgiving is supposed to be about family. I felt something inside me begin to break. What happened then? His little voice trembled as he answered. Mom said if I care so much about people who aren't invited, maybe I should spend Thanksgiving outside with them. My heart stopped. They sent you outside? He nodded slowly. 2 hours ago. 2 hours. My 9-year-old grandson had been sitting outside in freezing weather for 2 hours because he loved his grandfather enough to ask where I was. And while he sat there shivering in the cold, my family was sitting inside eating turkey, laughing together, and celebrating gratitude. At that moment, something changed inside me forever. I looked through the dining room window and saw Daniel smiling as he carved the Thanksgiving turkey. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked warm. No one seemed to notice that a child was missing from their table. No one cared enough to check on him. I held Ethan tightly against my chest and made him a promise. No one, I whispered quietly, will ever make you feel unwanted while I'm still breathing. I took his small hand in my own and slowly walked towards the front door. For 71 years, I have tried to solve every problem with patience and kindness. But there are moments in life when silence becomes another form of betrayal. And this was one of those moments. As I stood outside that door, listening to laughter coming from inside, I realized a heartbreaking thing. Sometimes strangers will show more humanity than family. I placed my hand upon the doorknob and looked down at my grandson. "Are you afraid?" I asked gently. He shook his head. "No," he whispered, "because you're here." And for the very first time that day, I smiled. What happened next changed our family forever.
I tightened my coat around Ethan's trembling shoulders and slowly reached for the doorknob. I could hear laughter coming from inside the house. Someone was telling a joke. Glasses were clinking together. Children were cheering over dessert. No one noticed that one child was missing. No one cared enough to ask where Ethan had gone. The realization hurt more than I can possibly describe. When Daniel was 9 years old, I still remember carrying him on my shoulders when he fell asleep during Thanksgiving celebrations. I remember working double shifts so he could have the bicycle he wanted for Christmas. I remember sitting beside his hospital bed when he had pneumonia and promising him that as long as I lived, I would never let anything bad happen to him. And now, that same little boy had become a father who could leave his own son freezing outside in the cold. Life has a cruel way of teaching us that love isn't always inherited. Sometimes it must be chosen. I slowly opened the front door and walked inside, holding Ethan's hand. Conversations immediately stopped as nearly 20 faces turned toward us. For a few seconds, no one spoke. I watched their expressions change from surprise to discomfort the moment they saw Ethan wrapped in my coat. My son stood beside the dining table, holding a carving knife in one hand, and smiled nervously. "Dad?" I asked. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I almost laughed at the question. For 71 years I have been a father. Today, I was simply being a grandfather. Before answering him, I looked around the room. There were beautiful decorations hanging on the walls. The smell of roasted turkey filled the house. Every chair around the table was occupied. Every chair except one. Ethan's chair sat empty beside his younger sister's place setting. They had prepared his plate, but somehow no one thought to bring him back inside. That image will remain with me forever. Sarah finally spoke. "Richard, you should have called before coming." There are moments in life when a sentence reveals more than the person intended. She wasn't asking whether Ethan was all right. She wasn't apologizing for what they had done. She was upset that I hadn't called first. I looked directly into her eyes before quietly asking, would calling first have made my grandson any warmer outside? Silence filled the room. Daniel quickly interrupted. "Dad, you're misunderstanding the situation." "No," I replied calmly. "For once in my life, I believe I'm understanding it perfectly." I looked down at Ethan standing beside me. His hands were still cold, despite being wrapped inside my coat pockets. "Tell everyone why you were outside, Ethan." He immediately lowered his head and squeezed my hand tighter. Daniel suddenly raised his voice. "He was being disrespectful." "Disrespectful," I repeated softly. "He embarrassed us in front of everyone." My grandson finally spoke in a trembling voice. "I only asked why Grandpa wasn't invited." The room became silent once again. No one expected that answer. An elderly woman sitting beside Sarah quietly removed her glasses and looked toward Daniel with obvious disappointment. I later learned she was Sarah's aunt. "You put him outside because of that?" she asked quietly. Sarah immediately defended herself. "That's not what happened." "Then please explain what happened," I asked calmly. She struggled to answer, because there are some actions in life that become impossible to justify once they're spoken aloud. Daniel placed the carving knife on the table before saying, "Dad, you're making this into something it isn't." Ethan needed discipline. I nodded slowly before asking him one simple question. "Did you know it was freezing outside today?" "Of course." "And approximately how long has your son been outside?" He hesitated. "Maybe 30 minutes. Ethan quietly shook his head beside me. "It was almost 2 hours, Grandpa." Several people sitting at the table immediately turned toward Daniel in disbelief. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns hot and quickly disappears. What I was feeling had become something much colder than anger. I was disappointed. The kind of disappointment that reaches places in your heart that words cannot describe.
I slowly removed my gloves and placed them into Ethan's hands before looking toward my son. "When you were 8 years old," I began quietly, "you had a terrible nightmare Thanksgiving weekend." Daniel looked confused by my sudden change of subject. "You climbed into my bed that night and asked me one question." He remained silent. "You asked me if fathers ever stop protecting their children." I could feel tears forming in my eyes as decades of memories returned all at once. "Do you remember what I told you?" He slowly shook his head. "I told you that fathers never stop protecting their children. Not when they're 8 years old, not when they're 38 years old, not ever." I looked down at Ethan before continuing. "And today, your 9-year-old son asked where your grandfather was because he believed family belongs together on Thanksgiving." No one spoke. "This little boy," he said softly, "was willing to spend Thanksgiving alone because he loved his grandfather enough to ask where I was. Tell me honestly, which one of us should feel ashamed today?" No one answered. For the first time since I had entered that house, I realized this wasn't simply about Thanksgiving dinner anymore. This was about the kind of people we choose to become. Children don't learn kindness by listening to our words. They learn kindness by watching our actions. And today, Ethan had learned something I never wanted him to learn, that sometimes adults can become cruel while pretending to teach children how to behave. I took a deep breath before speaking again. "You know what hurts me the most?" I asked quietly. "It's not that I wasn't invited here today." I paused for several seconds before continuing. "It's realizing that the little boy I spent my entire life protecting has forgotten how to protect his own." The tears in Daniel's eyes told me that my words had finally reached him. But some wounds cannot be healed in a single conversation, and some lessons come with consequences. I gently placed my hand upon Ethan's shoulder before making a decision that would surprise everyone sitting in that room. "Come on, buddy," I smiled softly. "Where are we going?" he asked. "We're going to have our own Thanksgiving dinner." His eyes immediately filled with excitement. "Really?" "Really. But we don't have any turkey." I laughed quietly and wiped away the tears from his face. "No, we don't." "Then what are we going to eat?" I smiled and looked back toward my son one last time before answering the question. "Something much more important than turkey." "What's that, Grandpa?" I squeezed his tiny hand gently and replied with words I hope he never forgets. "Love." And as we slowly began walking back toward the front door together, no one in that room realized that Thanksgiving Day was far from over, because sometimes God allows broken moments to reveal broken hearts, and before this day finally comes to an end, there are still truths waiting to be spoken, tears waiting to fall, and decisions waiting to change our family forever. The moment we stepped outside, I could feel Ethan squeezing my hand a little tighter. I don't think he was afraid anymore. I think for the first time that day, he simply felt safe. Sometimes children don't need expensive gifts or perfect holidays. Sometimes all they need is one person who refuses to let them feel abandoned. We slowly walked toward my car as snowflakes began falling from the dark November sky. Ethan looked up at me and smiled for the first time since I had arrived. "Grandpa?" "Yes, buddy?" "Can Thanksgiving still be Thanksgiving if there's no turkey?" I laughed quietly before opening the passenger door for him. "Of course it can." "How?" "Because Thanksgiving was never supposed to be about what sits on the table. It's about who sits beside you." He smiled before climbing into the car. Those words weren't only for him. They were for me as well. For years I had convinced myself that preserving peace inside the family was always the right thing to do.
Sometimes I remained silent when I should have spoken. Sometimes I excused behavior that never should have been excused. Growing older teaches you many things. One of them is understanding that protecting peace and protecting people are not always the same thing. Some people deserve your patience. Everyone deserves your kindness, but no one deserves your silence when cruelty is standing in front of you. As we drove away from Daniel's house, my phone began vibrating repeatedly. 5 missed calls, then 8, then 12. Daniel was calling. I wasn't ready to speak with him yet. Not because I hated him, because I loved him. And sometimes the hardest consequences are the ones given by people who still love you. 20 minutes later, Ethan and I found ourselves sitting inside a small family restaurant that remained open every Thanksgiving for people who had nowhere else to go. The restaurant wasn't crowded. There were only a few elderly couples sitting quietly together, and one young mother laughing with her little daughter. No one looked wealthy, no one looked important, and somehow it was the warmest Thanksgiving gathering I had seen all day. The waitress smiled warmly as she brought us hot chocolate. Ethan wrapped both of his hands around the cup before quietly asking me another question. "Grandpa?" "Yes?" "Were you lonely today before you came to our house?" Children have an extraordinary ability to ask questions adults spend years avoiding. I smiled before answering honestly. "Yes, buddy, I was." "Me too." Those 2 simple words broke my heart all over again. No child should ever feel lonely while surrounded by family. He remained quiet for several moments before speaking again. "I was saving you a piece of pie." I couldn't help but laugh softly through the tears forming in my eyes. "Were you?" He nodded happily. "I told Mommy that Grandpa likes apple pie." I suddenly remembered the apple pie sitting untouched inside my car, the very pie I had purchased for him. Life works in mysterious ways sometimes. "I bought something for you today, too," I smiled. His eyes widened immediately. "You did?" 3 somethings, actually. His face immediately lit up with excitement. For the next hour, we talked about everything except Thanksgiving. We talked about school, football, superheroes, and what he wanted to become when he grew up. Then he said something that completely caught me by surprise. "When I grow up, I want to be like you." I smiled before shaking my head. "No, Ethan." He looked confused. "Why not?" "Because I want you to become better than me." He smiled quietly before asking, "Is that possible?" It always is. The older I become, the more I realize that our greatest responsibility isn't leaving money behind for our children. It's leaving goodness behind for them. Money disappears. Houses become someone else's someday, but kindness has a remarkable habit of surviving long before we're gone. Nearly 2 hours passed before my phone rang once again. This time, it wasn't Daniel calling. It was Sarah's aunt. "Richard?" "Yes?" "I hope you'll forgive me for calling." "Of course." There was silence before she continued speaking. "I've spent 30 years working as a child psychologist." That surprised me. "And today," she continued quietly, "was one of the saddest things I've ever witnessed." I remained silent. "When you left," she continued quietly, "3 people left immediately after you." "What do you mean?" "My husband, Sarah's parents, and I walked out right behind you." That surprised me even more. "And dinner?" There wasn't one. "What happened?" She sighed quietly before answering. "Everyone stopped eating." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I don't believe I'll ever forget. "Richard, children will forget many things we give them, but they'll remember forever how we made them feel." I looked toward Ethan happily eating his dessert across the table. "I know," I whispered softly. "Daniel hasn't stopped crying since you left. Those words should have made me happy. They didn't. There's no joy in watching someone you love suffer, even when they've earned their consequences." Before ending the call, she quietly said one final thing. "You didn't embarrass your son today." "What do you mean?" "He embarrassed himself. You simply loved your grandson." After hanging up,
I sat silently for several minutes thinking about everything that had happened. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of becoming a parent. You never stop loving your children. Not when they succeed, not when they fail, and certainly not when they disappoint you. My phone vibrated once again. This time, it was a text message from Daniel. It simply said, "Dad, I don't deserve forgiveness today, but please don't let Ethan hate me." I stared at those words longer than I care to admit. Then another message arrived. I became the kind of father I promised myself I would never become. And then finally, "Please tell him I love him." I looked over at Ethan, laughing while trying to put extra marshmallows into his hot chocolate. Children forgive much faster than adults do. Perhaps that's why Jesus once said we should become more like them. There was still hope for my son, but forgiveness and restoration are two different journeys. Some bridges can be rebuilt in a single day. Others require us to carry every single stone ourselves. As I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over Ethan's tiny fingers, I realized something important. This story wasn't about Thanksgiving anymore. It was about second chances, not only for grandsons, not only for fathers, but perhaps for an entire family that had forgotten what love was supposed to look like. And little did I know, before this long Thanksgiving day finally came to an end, someone would be standing outside my front door, carrying something that no amount of money in this world could ever buy, something far more valuable than an apology. And when I opened that door later that night, my entire understanding of forgiveness would begin to change forever.
That evening, after I brought Ethan back to my house, we sat together beside the fireplace. The apple pie we had bought for one another was finally sitting between us on the table. Funny, isn't it? He had saved me a piece of pie without knowing whether I would ever come, and I had bought him one without knowing I would find him freezing outside in the cold. Perhaps God had been preparing both of our hearts long before Thanksgiving Day began. After dinner, I showed him the 3 small gifts I had bought earlier that morning. They weren't expensive. One was a football he had been asking for. Another was a book about great inventors because he loves asking questions. And the third was something much simpler, a small wooden frame with our picture together from his 8th birthday. On the bottom of the frame, I had written 7 simple words. "Always remember how deeply you are loved." He stared at those words quietly before asking me, "Grandpa, do you think Daddy loves me?" Children often ask the hardest questions. There are moments in life when honesty and kindness must walk hand in hand. "Yes," I answered softly. "I know he does." "Then why did he send me outside?" I smiled sadly before answering, "Because sometimes good people make terrible decisions. Even grown-ups? Especially grown-ups." He remained silent for several moments before speaking again. "Will Daddy still be my daddy tomorrow?" I laughed quietly through the tears filling my eyes. Nothing in this world could ever change that. I spent the next few minutes explaining something that I wish more adults understood. Love isn't proven by perfection. It's proven by what we do after we've made mistakes. The greatest parents aren't the ones who never fail. They're the ones humble enough to apologize when they do. At nearly 9 o'clock that evening, someone knocked gently on my front door. For some reason, I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Daniel was standing there, holding his car keys in one hand and crying silently. I hadn't seen my son cry since the day we buried his mother 12 years ago. He looked older somehow, smaller somehow, not because time had passed over the course of a single day, but because guilt has a remarkable ability to humble us. "Dad," he whispered quietly. I remained silent. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes fell upon my coat hanging beside the front door, the same coat I had wrapped around Ethan earlier that afternoon, and suddenly he began crying even harder. "I saw his footprints," he whispered. "What?" "When I got home this evening, I saw his footprints outside the front steps." He paused for several moments before continuing. "I stood there looking at those footprints for almost an hour, Dad." His voice trembled as he continued speaking.
All I could think about was the day I was 6 when I got lost inside the shopping mall. I immediately remembered that day. You carried me all the way back to the car because I wouldn't stop crying. He smiled sadly before continuing. Do you remember what you told me? Of course I remembered. I told him that no matter where life takes him, he would never have to search very far to find me, because fathers always come looking for their children. I remembered every word today, and then I realized I never went looking for mine. There are moments when apologies become so sincere that words simply aren't necessary. He wasn't standing before me as a 43-year-old successful businessman anymore. He was simply my little boy who had lost his way. I failed him today, he whispered. Yes, I answered honestly. I failed you too. Yes. And I failed myself. This time I simply nodded silently. He wasn't asking for excuses anymore. He was accepting responsibility. Then he slowly reached inside his coat pocket and handed me something I never expected to see. It was a small handmade Thanksgiving card. On the front, written in child's handwriting, were the words, "My hero is my grandpa." It was inside Ethan's school bag today. He made it for his school project last week. My hands immediately began shaking. Inside the card was another sentence written carefully with blue crayons. I want to become kind like my grandpa because he never lets people feel alone. By that point, neither of us could stop crying. I almost destroyed that little boy's beautiful heart today, Daniel whispered. And the saddest part is that he was trying to become more like the man I should have become years ago. For nearly 70 years, life has taught me many things. But perhaps one of the greatest lessons is this. People deserve consequences for their actions. They also deserve opportunities to become better. Forgiveness doesn't erase yesterday. It simply gives tomorrow another chance. Can I see him? He asked quietly. Are you ready to apologize? He immediately nodded. No, I replied softly. Are you ready to listen? Because apologies aren't only about speaking. They're also about listening to the pain we've caused others. A few moments later, Ethan slowly walked into the living room, wearing his pajamas and carrying his favorite blanket. The moment he saw his father standing there, he stopped walking. Daniel immediately knelt before him. I'm sorry, he whispered through his tears. I'm so sorry, buddy. There were no excuses, no explanations, no attempts to justify what had happened. Only 2 words that every parent must sometimes learn to say, I'm sorry. For several moments, Ethan simply stood there looking at his father before quietly asking, Are you still sad? Very sad, answered Daniel honestly. Because of me? No, he replied immediately. Because of me. Then something happened that reminded me why children are sometimes wiser than adults. Ethan quietly walked towards his father and wrapped his tiny arms around his neck. I forgive you, Daddy. 4 simple words, 4 beautiful words, and perhaps the most powerful words spoken that entire Thanksgiving day. As I stood there watching them embrace one another, I realized something important. Families aren't strong because they never break. They're strong because they're willing to heal together when they do. That Thanksgiving day didn't become our family's darkest memory. It became our greatest lesson. Today, every Thanksgiving, we still gather around the same dinner table. But before anyone touches their food, Ethan always asks everyone the same question. Is anyone feeling left out today? And no one laughs when he asks, because everyone sitting around that table remembers why he asks it. The small wooden picture frame still sits upon Ethan's bedside table today, and after everything that happened, I added one more sentence beneath the original 7 words. Always remember how deeply you are loved, and never let anyone feel unloved. Because life isn't measured by the money we leave behind. It's measured by the hearts we protect along the way. And if there's one thing I hope my grandson remembers long after I'm gone, it's this. Never allow kindness to become weakness. Never allow silence to become permission for cruelty. And never forget that sometimes the greatest gift we can place on a Thanksgiving table isn't turkey or pie or beautiful decorations. Sometimes it's simply making sure that no one has been left outside in the cold.